Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Jayādvaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Jayādvaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Jai Om Vishnupad Purnamansa Paripraja Kacharja Ashto Tarasatashi Srimad A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki Jai, Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai, Prem Sakaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai, Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gopinath, Sham Gun Radha Kun Giri Govardhan Ki Jai, Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Navadip Dham Ki Jai, Jagannath Puri Ki Jai, Gangamai Ki Jai, Ramanamai Ki Jai, Tulsi Devi Ki Jai, Bhakti Devi Ki Jai, Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. Gaur Premanande, Hari Hari Bol. Welcome to our weekly reading of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. We're in Adi Lila, chapter 5, text 41. And today is Friday, February 17th, 2023 in Vrindavan, and one day earlier in New York. And as a practical matter, Zoom has updated their Linux client with the result that my chat box is now very readable, but I don't see everybody in the screen the way I used to. I see some, but not all. So raised hands I may not see. So you might want to jump in with video or put your hand up on chat. We'll see how that goes after we get used to it on my side. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Vasudeva Sankarshana Pradumna Aniruddha Vitiya Chaturvyuha Turiya Vishuddha. Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradumna, and Aniruddha constitute this second quadruple. They are purely transcendental. Om Jnana Timirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurn Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Koda Mahyam Dadhati Shapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Jutopada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Shagrashatam Shahagana Raganatan Vitam Stam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savatutam Harijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lodita Sri Vishakan Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namospate Tapta Kamshana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hori Priye Vansha Kolpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindho Pyevacha Patita Nam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Shadi Gaur Bhaktarinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. In this section of Chaitanya Charitamrita, the identity of Nityananda Prabhu with Lord Balaram has been established, and we're hearing about the glories of Lord Balaram or Nityananda Ram in terms of in this portion, the expansion of the Lord for maintaining the entire spiritual sky. And while we're at it, the material creation as well. These all come from the Lord Balaram. And in the previous verse, we heard that in the spiritual sky, on the four sides of Narayan, are the second expansions of the quadruple expansions of Dwarka. It gets a little expansive here, expansions of expansions. The original expansions are Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradumna, and Aniruddha. Then Vasudeva expands as a second set of the same quadruple. So there's a second quadruple expansion. Then, hold on 1 second. Get things right. Okay. So in this purport, which is going to be expansive, Srila Prabhupada is going to be commenting on Shankaracharya's take on Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradumna, and Aniruddha in his Sharirak Pasha, his Vedanta commentary. This is going to be quite the substantial presentation. First, Shankaracharya's philosophy or his view, and then the replies by the Vaishnava Acharyas. One time, while editing Chaitanya Charitamrita, I may have mentioned this before, I was editing and Prabhupada was summarizing something said by, I think, Madhusudan Saraswati, an impersonalist commentary. and on Vedanta. And after editing that particular portion of Prabhupada's purport, I wrote to Prabhupada, along with some other things, that I'm not sure that I've edited this right. It doesn't seem to make sense. And Prabhupada replied, yes, it doesn't make sense. You've edited it right. So we're in for some tricky arguments here. And let's jump in. Sripad Shankaracharya has misleadingly explained the quadruple form, Chaturvyuha, in his interpretation of the 42nd aphorism of chapter 2 of the second kanda of the Vedanta Sutra, Utpatya Sambhavat. In verses 41 through 47 of this chapter of Sri Caitanya Charitamrita, Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami answers Sripad Shankaracharya's misleading objections to the personal feature of the absolute truth. So that's the overview. Supreme Personality of Godhead, the absolute truth, is not like a material object that can be known by experimental knowledge or sense perception. In the Narada Panchratra, this fact has been explained by Narayan himself to Lord Shiva. But Shankaracharya, the incarnation of Shiva, under the order of Narayan, his master, had to mislead the monists who favor ultimate extinction. In the conditioned stage of existence, all living entities have 4 basic defects, of which one is the cheating propensity. Shankaracharya has carried this cheating propensity to the extreme to mislead the monists. Actually, the explanation of the quadruple forms in the Vedic literature cannot be understood by the speculation of a conditioned soul. The quadruple forms should therefore be accepted just as they're described. The authority of the Vedas is such that even if one does not understand something by his limited perception, he should accept the Vedic injunction and not create interpretations to suit his imperfect understanding. In his Sharirak Pasha, however, Shankaracharya has increased the misunderstanding of the monists. So this is a basic principle. The Vedic injunctions should be accepted as they are without needless interpretations. But sometimes we see the Vedic statements interpreted to suit someone's own previous imperfect misunderstandings. We see this in the devotional field too, that we take some Prabhupada quotes and we cherry pick them or interpret them so as to support a particular view. That is not what we should be doing. The idea is to accept Prabhupada's statements as they are, and not try to interpret them to fit something that might be more acceptable or that fits with a particular agenda. The quadruple forms have a spiritual existence that can be realized in Vasudeva Sattva, Shuddha Sattva, or unqualified goodness. which accompanies complete absorption in the understanding of Vasudeva. The quadruple forms, who are full in the six opulences of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, are the enjoyers of the internal potency. Thinking the absolute personality of Godhead to be poverty-stricken, or to have no potency, or in other words, to be impotent, is simply rascaldom. This rascaldom is the profession of the conditioned soul, and it increases his bewilderment. The idea here is that the personality of Godhead has variegated potencies, and he enjoys, especially his pleasure potency. The goddess of fortune is the pleasure potency of the Lord, and she's the goddess of all wealth and so on, Lakshmi. The living entities want to enjoy the energies of the Lord and put the Lord in the background or out of the picture entirely. And therefore they become bewildered or are bewildered. One who cannot understand the distinctions between the spiritual world and the material world has no qualification to examine or know the situation of the transcendental quadruple forms. In his commentary on Vedanta Sutra 2.2.42 through 45, His Holiness Sripad Shankaracharya has made a futile attempt to nullify the existence of these quadruple forms in the spiritual world. Now we have a question in the chat box. Let's take a look at it. Panchatattva. We talk about how every living entity in this material world wants to avoid death or the end of their life. But the manas favor what Srila Prabhupada calls ultimate extinction. Isn't this completely contrary to the very will to exist, whether in the bodily concept of life or not? Well, yes and no. It certainly is contrary to the very will to exist, and therefore Prabhupada calls it spiritual suicide. The idea is that material existence is so frustrating, so very frustrating, that one hopes to extinguish one's existence. One may have some realization that one exists lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, and one sees in this nothing but endless suffering. So one therefore thinks, well, better than suffering life after life is to, what's going on? Better than suffering life after life is to reach nirvana or freedom from suffering. But this is really throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We get rid of our suffering, but at the cost of our individuality. So the price is exceedingly high. On the other side, this ultimate extinction of individuality carries with it, in the Mayavadi conception, the sense that one is actually becoming absolute, that one is becoming identical with the ultimate reality So even though the concept is impersonal, even though one has no individual identity, according to this view, one somehow becomes, identical with the Supreme. There was some item there, various, I think it was the journalist that, Gonzo journalist, Hunter Thompson. He put it in his will that when he expired, he wanted his remains, I think, if I vaguely recall what I heard, that he wanted his remains like blasted off in a rocket and, scattered into into outer space. So one gets this idea that somehow one merges with the universe in that way. And again, a material conception that one is, I may have died, but I've come into a larger, a greater and larger frame of existence. Even people of a materialistic view think that when they're buried, their remains are now going to merge with the earth, earth to earth. So they see that as from a sort of sentimental viewpoint, as achieving a sort of ongoing existence. Well, these are all material ideas, but then carried to the spiritual platform, one thinks that one is going to exist forever in an absolute identity, free from all material contamination, which means, of course, free from form, qualities, name, and so on, because these are all contaminating. So in one sense, I'm going to be completely extinct, or in another sense, I'm going to be absolute. I'm going to be everything. So in the mind, these ideas are there. I hope that helps. If someone wants to add something to these thoughts, feel free.
Thank you, Guru Maharaj.
Thank you, Panchatattva Prabhu. So now we come to Shankaracharya's attempt to nullify the existence of the Chaturvyuha. Shankaracharya says, and probably we're not going to get past, we may not get past today, the Shankaracharya's points, and then we'll have to move on to the refutations gradually. Let's see. Shankaracharya says, Sutra 42, that devotees think the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva, Sri Krishna, to be one, to be free from material qualities, and to have a transcendental body full of bliss and eternal existence. He is the ultimate goal of the devotees who believe that the Supreme Personality of Godhead expands himself into four other eternal transcendental forms: Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha. From Vasudeva, who is the primary expansion, come Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha in that order. Another name of Vasudeva is Paramatma. Another name of Sankarshan is Jiva, the living entity. Another name of Praduna is mind, and another name of Aniruddha is Ahankar, false ego. Among these expansions, Vasudeva is considered the origin of the material nature. Therefore, Shankaracharya says that Sankarshan, Pradumna, and Aniruddha must be creations of that original cause. Great souls assert that, well, hold on one second, let me do one thing. Oh, okay. Before we get to what great souls assert, there's a question by Akendra Prabhu. And you're on my screen, by the way, Akendra Prabhu, so you could just raise your hand if you like.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Maharaj. I'm sorry to stop you right when you're getting rolling with Shankaracharya, but there is something that I had a question about from an earlier paragraph where Prabhupada is saying that the explanation of the quadruple forms cannot be understood by the speculation, conditioned speculations, and that they should be accepted as they are described. What that brought up for me was I've been thinking about how to attain sure and certain knowledge of a thing. And the best we know is to receive things from authority. And also Prabhupada has said that interpretation is required only when the meaning is not clear. Also, but for me, the quadruple forms have always been a very difficult point for me to understand. So I accept them, but were I to attempt to explain them to anyone else, I don't feel I would be able to because I don't really understand them. So then my question is how to explain something that you don't actually understand, like my example of the Chaturvyuha in my own case.
Well, I suppose that what we have to do under such circumstances is say, well, here's what the authority says. Here's as far as my understanding goes, perhaps not very far, and leave it at that. And here are my sources. And if you want to read more, jump in. But even like in academia, everything becomes ever increasingly specialized. In medicine, the same thing happens. So we become specialized, and then things that are outside of our specialty, we say, well, this is as far as I understand, but I can't go further than that. I know, I think Doug had said that in regard to COVID-19, there was someone who was a microbiologist, and he was asked a question about the COVID virus, and he just gave a sort of a general response, and then said, well, but I'm not a virologist. So as far as understanding the COVID-19 virus, being a microbiologist isn't enough. You have to be a virologist, and then I suppose a particular type of virologist. So there are aspects of Shastra that we may, be conversant with or be aware of, but we don't really have in-depth knowledge of it, of them. So then there may be specialists, persons who have studied these matters more in depth, and they would be the experts on such things. We find that in regard to the Vedas, Vyasa divides up the four Vedas and entrusts each Veda to a particular sage. So that sage becomes the expert, the authority in that Veda. And then one supposes that below that there are sub-authorities and sub-authorities for various portions. Okay. Okay. So let's see what great souls assert. Great souls assert that Narayan, who is known as the Paramatma, or Supersoul, is beyond material nature. And this is in accordance with the statements of the Vedic literature. Mayavadis also agree that Narayan can expand himself in various forms. Shankaracharya says that he does not attempt to argue that portion of the devotee's understanding, but he must protest the idea that Sankarshan is produced from Vasudeva, Pradyumna is produced from Sankarshan, and Aniruddha is produced from Pradyumna. For if Sankarshan is understood to represent the living entities created from the body of Vasudeva, the living entities would have to be non-eternal. The living entities are supposed to be freed from material contamination by engaging in prolonged temple worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, reading Vedic literature, and performing yoga and pious activities to attain the Supreme Lord. But if the living entities had been created from material nature at a certain point, they would be non-eternal and would have no chance to be liberated and associate with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When a cause is nullified, its results are nullified. In the second chapter of the Vedanta Sutra's second kanda, Acharya Vedavyas has also refuted the conception that the living entities were ever born. Tadma shuter nityatvat chatabhyaha. Because there's no creation for the living entities, they must be eternal. Shankaracharya says that devotees think that Pradyumna, who is considered to represent the senses, has sprung from Sankarshan, who is considered to represent the living entities. But we cannot actually experience that a person can produce senses. Devotees also say that from Pradyumna has sprung Aniruddha, who is considered to represent the ego. But Shankaracharya says that unless the devotees can show how ego and the means of knowledge can generate from a person, such an explanation of the Vedanta Sutra cannot be accepted for no other philosophers except the sutras in that way. Shankaracharya also says, Sutra 44, that he cannot accept the devotee's idea that Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha are equally as powerful as the absolute personality of Godhead, full in the six opulences of knowledge, wealth, strength, fame, beauty, and renunciation, and free from the flaw of generation at a certain point. Even if they are full expansions, the flaw of generation remains. Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha, being distinct individual persons, cannot be one. Therefore, if they are accepted as absolute, full, and equal, there would have to be many personalities of Godhead, but there's no need to accept that there are many personalities of Godhead, because the acceptance of one omnipotent God is sufficient for all purposes. The acceptance of more than one God is contradictory to the conclusion that Lord Vasudeva, the absolute personality of Godhead, is one without a second. Yes. even if we agree to accept that the quadruple forms of Godhead are all identical, we cannot avoid the incongruous flaw of non-eternity. Unless we accept that there are some differences among the personalities, there's no meaning to the idea that Sankarshan is an expansion of Vasudeva, Pradyumna is an expansion of Sankarshan, and Aniruddha is an expansion of Pradyumna. There must be a distinction between cause and effect. For example, a pot is distinct from the earth of which it is made, and therefore we can ascertain that the earth is the cause and the pot is the effect. Without such distinctions, there's no meaning to cause and effect. Tulsi Priya says, could you please explain the flaw of generation? Yeah, generation means not generation after generation in the genealogical sense, but it means the flaw of being generated from something, or the flaw of being generated, period. If the living entities are generated, they're not eternal. If personalities of Godhead are generated, then there's cause and effect involved. And how can something eternal be an effect of some cause? Then again, it would be subject to limitation. Yeah, having a beginning. You have the flaw of having a beginning, or you have the flaw of there being multiple persons, or then you say they're all one person, but then how could they all be one? If they were all one, there'd be no meaning to saying that there are four. So that these are Shankaracharya's charges. Yes, another question.
Thank you, Maharaj. Hare Krishna. So previous paragraphs where it's talking about another name of Vasudeva is Paramatma, another name of Sankarshan is Jiva, another name of Pradyumna is mind, and another name of Aniruddha is Ahankara. So my question is, it's very plain there, Jiva, so, or mind. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, are in the same way we talk about Paramatma, like, we say Paramatma exists in the heart of every atom, in the heart of every living being. We don't say that there are multiple Paramatmas. There's just one Paramatma. And I remember being surprised to learn when I was very new that when we talk about Tulsi Devi, that there's not really multiple Tulsi Devis. There's just one Tulsi, but she exists in a multitude of Tulsi plants all over. So, but this seems to be in kind of the opposite direction. In other words, is Sankarshan like the principle of Jiva? And then, with the simultaneous oneness and difference, there are multiple forms of Jiva, but they're all also, they're individuals, but they're simultaneously one with this Jiva. And Pradyumna is mind. Is there really only one mind, and yet it manifests in these variety of forms within Jivas? And same thing with Ahankara, so we're all like sort of little samples, even our false egos are little samples of the supreme false ego, and even our minds are the little samples of the Pradyumna. Does that make sense, that question?
Well, let's see if we can sort it out. It seems that what's going on here, and we'll come to it as the answers unfold, is that Shankaracharya is, of course, misrepresenting the devotional position. He's setting up essentially a straw man argument, or in any case, a misunderstanding the Sankarshan may be known as Jiva, but not because he is the Jiva or that he's the totality of the Jivas. He's in charge of the Jivas, or he has the Shakti to expand the Jivas. But it's not that he's a Jiva or that he's all the Jivas. There's that would be a misrepresentation. Similarly, the idea of mind expanding, of Pradyumna being, I don't know, how does he put it? Yeah, that yeah. The Pradyumna is the senses that the and who's the mind here? It's
Pradyumna.
Pradyumna again. Or Aniruddha's the ego. So these are don't accurately represent the devotee's position. So it seems to me that he's arguing, as Prabhupada said, cleverly or misleadingly.
So the Mayavadi position is that that the existence of the personality of God himself is a function of Maya. In other words, there's nothing, and then illusion creates the supreme being, and then there are these different expansions which are different facets. Is that a general kind of way of understanding the Mayavadi position?
That the existence of the living beings is illusory, yes.
Yeah.
But there's only one absolute truth, Eka Brahma Dvitiya Nasti.
Right, and the personality of Godhead is a feature of the illusion as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, all right, yeah, thank you very much.
Is that heater off? I think since there's some, maybe open the door a little bit here. Really stuffy here. Doug asks, how does the common issue of an infinite regression of cause and effect get resolved in our Krishna conscious framework? Is it more than just a prime mover argument? Well, the prime mover argument it's a logical argument and a worthwhile argument also. A worthwhile argument. But our ultimate resolution is that we don't depend on argument. We depend on authority. And Satsvarup Maharaj wrote a letter to Srila Prabhupada saying something to the effect of presenting that our philosophy is logic, authority and logic, and Prabhupada said, no, it's authority. We know not by authority and logic, but by authority. And the logic is provided afterward to, what should we say, to persuade others or to bring others on board. But our understanding doesn't come from logic or a combination of authority and logic. It comes from authority. Father says, this is a watch, we accept this is a watch. Apart from that, so it's an infinite regression. There is a prime mover argument. And I saw that, I think I quoted it in a previous class. There was a very good exposition of the prime mover argument by a Muslim scholar who really did an excellent job of explaining why there couldn't just be an infinite regress of dependent entities. Every one of those entities, starting with us, depends on something else, depends on something else. So we all have that characteristic of being dependent on something else. But if every entity had that characteristic of depending on something else, and there were no other entities to be found, then the characteristic of depending on something else would be meaningless, because we're all like in a chain that ultimately isn't attached to something. And we're all hanging by as links on a chain that's unfastened at the top, or that has no ultimate shelter, no ultimate fastening point. So there must be an entity that's different, that doesn't have that quality of being dependent on yet another entity, yet another entity, yet another entity. There must be a dependable entity, an entity on which the other entities depend. And that's stated in the first verse of the Bhagavatam, Abhigya Swarat. I offer my obeisances to Lord Shri Krishna, Vasudeva, because among other reasons, he's Swarat, he's completely independent. Every other living entity is dependent. And the absolute truth, or the personality of Godhead, is independent. That's the statement of Vedic literature. So that's where we get it. And then any arguments that we might wish to offer are for their persuasive value, not for our own determining what the truth is. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Maharaj. That's kind of how I like to think about it too. It's a dependency, and you can have an infinite regression that's still contingent on something outside of that. So I like the prime mover argument, and it's always attributed to the Greeks, but I'm just like, no, it seems like it's already been talked about.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else on this? Okay. Now.
There's a comment from Saraswati in the chat.
Okay. An interesting feature of this newest version of Zoom is that chat window doesn't automatically show me the newest. It stays static. Tattva says, it appears that straw man arguments may have originated with the Manas. Well, the Manas have enough faults. I don't know that we could definitively pin them as being the origin of straw man arguments. Anytime people argue about something, could be the price of rice, or it could be what the absolute truth is. There'll be misrepresentation. So Manas have enough wrong with them. I don't know that we have to add that. Saraswati says, I'm confused with this Mayavadi explanation, because we know that Krishna's expansions, Vishnu Tattvas, are like the original candle, Krishna, lighting other candles. Not sure if it's simultaneously or sequentially, but in the absence of time in the eternal realm, there's no question of there being first, second, etc., or sometime born at a certain time. They're eternal. Sorry if the question's confusing. Well, your question is like the one I asked Prabhupada. This doesn't seem to make sense. Are we representing it properly? Prabhupada said, yes, it's properly edited. Doesn't make sense. So that's what we're finding already with Shankaracharya, that it's not quite representing things as representing the Vaishnavas as saying what the Vaishnavas actually say. Now let's see if we know where we are. I don't. Where are we? I had to scroll back to. Okay.
Aren't we in the paragraph that begins with Sankaracharya also says Sutra 44, and then quite a bit further down, for example, a pot is distinct from the earth, and then after that, somewhere around furthermore, the followers of the Pancharatric principles.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. So let's start from there. Furthermore, the followers of the Pancharatric principles do not accept any differences in knowledge and qualities between Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha. The devotees accept all these expansions to be one. But then why should they restrict oneness to these quadruple expansions? Certainly we should not do so for all living entities, from Brahma to the insignificant ant, are expansions of Vasudeva, as accepted in all the Shrutis and Smritis. So if you're going to say that Vasudeva's identical with Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha, why is he not also identical with you and me? Shankaracharya also says, Sutra 45, that the devotees who follow the Pancharatra state that God's qualities and God himself, as the owner of the qualities, are the same. But how can the Bhagavad school state that the six opulences, wisdom, wealth, strength, fame, beauty, and renunciation, are identical with Lord Vasudeva? This is impossible. Well, that seems like a good place to stop, and we can resume. In fact, we're exactly in the right place to stop, because now Srila Rupa Goswami is going to reply to Shankaracharya. So at this point, just on the verge of hearing the Vaishnava answers, we'll stop for this evening. And who's volunteering to do kirtan, I wonder?
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Paripajikacharya Ashtottara Satashi Srimad A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami Raj Prabhupada Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Aim Sikaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shiva Sadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gopinath Sham Kund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan ki jai. Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Navadip Dham ki jai. Jagannath Puri ki jai. Ganga Mai ki jai. Jamana Mai ki jai. Tulsi Devi ki jai. Bhakti Devi ki jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. Gaur Premanande. Well, thank you again to all for taking part today. And we look forward to continuing next week with the response to Shankaracharya by Srila Rupa Goswami and other Vaishnavacharyas. Hare Krishna. Thank you all again. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaur Premanande. Hari Bo.
Haribol Gurudev.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Kantiya.
Always so much to reflect upon after these sessions. It's just
Well,
wonderful.
Especially here, Srila Prabhupada's really loaded us up with Mayavadi
Yeah.
philosophy.
It is kind of unusual to have that explained at such length, presented at such length. You hear bits and pieces or just one argument here and there, but this is a whole presentation of Sankaracharya's developed attack.
Yes, it is. So somehow the image that comes to my mind is that of a boxing ring. We're going to see or anyway, whatever it is, he's launched his attack, and now the response will be forthcoming. All right. Thank you again. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you, Prabhupada.
Thank you, Shraddha. Hare Krishna. Thank you to all.